The chief had spent most of his life in deserts. From Afghanistan to Iraq, Syria to unnamed specks of sand on the map, he had marched through dust storms, eaten MREs that felt older than his kids, and seen enough firefights to recognize when someone belonged and when someone didn't. On that particular afternoon, the sun bore down like a hammer. The Forward Operating Base, or FOB, was quiet except for the groan of Humvee engines and the metallic clatter of weapons being serviced. The chief walked through the yard, scanning as he always did, never relaxing, even in safe zones. Years of combat had wired him to see everything: the lazy grip of a private's rifle, the telltale dust rising from a convoy arriving at the gates, the silence that fell a second too early. That's when he saw her. At first, she seemed like any other soldier: smaller frame, standard fatigues, hair tied back under her cap. But then he noticed the rifle. Not just any rifle. The Barrett M82.50 caliber. A beast of steel and recoil, heavy enough that most operators cursed when assigned to carry it. It wasn't the kind of weapon you cleaned absent-mindedly, but that's exactly what she was doing. Seated cross-legged on a crate, calm as a monk, running a cloth across the barrel as if polishing a family heirloom. The chief slowed his steps. Something about the picture didn't fit. He'd seen plenty of guys wrestle with the Barrett, struggling to even shoulder it without wincing. This woman, and she was young, maybe mid-20s at most, handled it like it was second nature. No strain, no hesitation. Just muscle memory. She looked up briefly as his shadow crossed over her, eyes a pale, unreadable shade behind her sunglasses. A nod, nothing more. Then she went back to adjusting the scope. The chief stopped. His instincts told him not to move on. He'd learned to trust that little voice inside, the one that had saved him from walking into ambush more than once. So he stood, arms crossed, studying her. Most soldiers, when aware of a SEAL chief's gaze, fidgeted. They adjusted their gear, straightened up, tried to prove they belonged. Not her. She worked silently, deliberate, each movement smooth. She didn't seem to care who was watching. "What's your most, soldier?" He finally asked, his voice low, gravelly from years of shouting commands over rotor blades and gunfire. "Sniper," she replied without looking up. Her voice was steady, calm, no hint of challenge, no hint of insecurity. Just fact. The chief raised an eyebrow. A sniper. He'd trained, fought, and bled alongside some of the finest sharpshooters in the world. Men who could hit a target the size of a melon from over a mile away. But never had he seen someone so young, so unassuming, claim the title without hesitation. "You shoot that thing?" He gestured at the Barrett. She glanced at him again, then back at the rifle. Every day. Her answer wasn't cocky. It wasn't defensive. It was normal. As if carrying a 70-pound rifle into combat was as routine as brushing teeth. The chief let out a breath through his nose, half amused, half skeptical. He'd met rookies before. Cocky kids who thought one good shot on a range made them snipers. They usually folded when the wind shifted or when a target wasn't paper, but a man shooting back. But there was something different here. Something in the way her hands moved over the weapon, like a pianist over ivory keys. Intimate, experienced. He pulled a folding chair closer and sat, watching. Not interrogating, just observing. Sometimes silence drew out more truth than a dozen questions. Around them, the FOB carried on. Soldiers laughed near the mess tent. Mechanics cursed at a stubborn engine. The radio tower crackled with distant chatter. But here, in this small pocket of shade, it felt like another world. Just a woman and her rifle, and a chief trying to figure her out. Finally, she spoke. "You've seen men with this rifle before." It wasn't a question. "Plenty," he said. She nodded. tightening the bipod legs. Most of them treat it like a burden. Too heavy, too loud, too much recoil. They complain. They flinch. They fight the weapon instead of learning from it. And you don't? Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. The Barrett teaches patience. You don't rush it. You don't force it. You let the weapon do what it was designed to do. The chief leaned back, studying her. He didn't know what answer he expected, but it wasn't that. He'd heard Marines call the Barrett everything from a shoulder-breaking bastard to cannon, but never had anyone described it with respect. What's your name? He asked. She hesitated, then gave it. Simple. No rank, no preamble. Just her name. He filed it away. Names meant everything in this world. A name could end up written on a wall someday, etched into stone. Or it could disappear into the void, remembered only by the brothers and sisters who fought alongside them. A sudden crack split the air, gunfire from the range beyond the wall. Both of them looked instinctively. The chief scanned the perimeter, habits ingrained. She, however, didn't flinch. Her eyes lingered only a second before returning to her rifle. That told him more than her words. He stood again, brushing sand from his pants. "I'll be watching you," he said. It wasn't a threat. Not quite a compliment either. More like a marker laid down. She nodded, still cleaning, as if the world outside their small bubble didn't matter. As the chief walked away, the heat shimmering around him, a thought gnawed at him. She didn't belong, and yet she belonged more than most. For the first time in a long while, he felt curiosity, even anticipation. Who was she really? What had brought her here, to this unforgiving place, with that rifle in her hands? Something told him he hadn't just stumbled across another soldier. He'd walked into the first page of a story he didn't yet understand, but one he knew he needed to. And somewhere deep inside, the chief felt a rare, unsettling thing. Respect, not yet earned but demanded by presence alone. The Barrett .50 was never meant for comfort. At 30 pounds, with a recoil that slammed like a sledgehammer, it was a weapon that punished mistakes. Even seasoned operators often preferred lighter rifles that didn't rattle their bones with every trigger pull. To most, the Barrett was a necessary evil, dragged along when armor needed punching, or when enemies hid too far away for smaller calibers to touch. But to her, the Barrett was different. The chief realized that the first time he watched her, on the firing line. It was late afternoon, the desert sky turning molten orange. The range stretched out in front of him, dunes painted gold in the dying light. A few soldiers had gathered, rifles slung lazily, watching her set up. Word had gotten around camp. The girl with the cannon was going to shoot. The chief kept his distance at first, arms crossed, leaning against a Humvee. He told himself he was just there to observe, to pass judgment quietly, the way SEALs often did. But in truth, curiosity dragged him closer. She lay prone in the sand, the Barrett resting on its bipod, scope glinting in the sun. The weapon dwarfed her frame, the long barrel stretching far past her shoulders. Any other sniper would have looked like the rifle was in charge, but not her. She owned it. Targets at 1800, a range instructor called out, voice echoing across the open desert. Steel plates 4 foot wide, 1800 meters. Over a mile. A shot most sharpshooters considered difficult, even under perfect conditions. The wind was gusting now, tugging at flags planted downrange, shifting the mirage of heat waves. Not an ideal setup. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for adjustments. She simply settled into the dirt, cheek pressed to the stock, fingers adjusting the scope with surgical precision. The chief watched her breathing, controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow, methodical, the kind of breathing that only came from endless practice. Then the Barrett thundered. The blast rattled through the yard, dust lifting off the ground, soldiers flinching at the shockwave. The chief had braced for it, but still, the sound hit him in the chest. Seconds later, the faint clang of steel echoed back. Direct hit. The onlookers murmured. Some nodded in approval, others muttered disbelief. But she wasn't done. She adjusted again, shifting slightly. Another shot cracked the air. Another hit. Again. And again. 4 shots, 4 hits. At a distance where most shooters might be happy landing 1 in 5, she was flawless. The chief felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't luck. This was mastery. And yet, she didn't celebrate. Didn't look around for recognition. She simply rolled onto her back, stretched her arms, and sat up, brushing sand from her sleeves. Like it was just another day. One of the soldiers whistled low. "Damn, she shoots better than half of us. Better than most," another corrected. The chief said nothing. His eyes stayed locked on her, searching for cracks, arrogance, insecurity, bravado. But there was none. Just calm. She stood, slung the Barrett over her shoulder with effort, but without struggle, and started back toward the tents. The crowd parted silently, giving her space. Respect hung in the air, though few admitted it aloud. The chief followed, keeping his pace measured. He caught up as she placed the rifle carefully on a rack inside the armory. "You've got steady hands," he said, his voice rough from years of combat. She glanced at him, a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. "Comes with practice." That distance. 1800. Most shooters would have missed at least 2. Then most shooters rush. The chief studied her. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she said them. Calm, factual, without arrogance. She wasn't boasting. She was teaching, in her own way. "You sound like you've been behind that rifle longer than I've been walking deserts," he said. "Long enough," she replied. They fell into silence, the hum of generators filling the gap. Finally, the chief spoke again. "You know men are talking. Whispers about you. Some say you're just hype. Others say you're the real deal." She shrugged, unslinging her helmet and setting it on the table. "Whispers don't matter. The rifle speaks for itself." That answer struck him harder than the Barrett's recoil. The chief had met countless soldiers who lived for approval, for recognition, for the stories passed around campfires. She didn't seem to care about any of it. For the first time, he felt the beginnings of something unusual stirring inside. Respect. Unwanted, unexpected, but undeniable. As he left the armory, he replayed the shots in his mind, the way the steel had rung, perfect, one after another. She hadn't flinched, hadn't hesitated. He realized something he hadn't expected. This wasn't going to be a story of proving her wrong. This was going to be a story of him catching up, trying to understand the measure of someone who had already surpassed expectations before he even met her. And though he didn't know it yet, those first impressions would stay with him long after the war ended. The barracks after dark were a world of their own. The desert sun had retreated, but the heat lingered in the concrete walls, turning the rooms into ovens. Soldiers sprawled on cots, boots half off, the air thick with the smell of sweat, gun oil, and instant coffee. Conversations filled the space in waves, bursts of laughter, low curses, whispers of home. The chief had heard it all before. War zones always sounded the same after nightfall, tired men and women trying to drown silence with noise. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the noise had a center, and that center was her. It started at one corner of the room, 2 infantrymen talking over a game of spades. Swear to God, she tagged steel at 1800. 4 for 4. You ever seen that before? One muttered, shuffling cards. His buddy scoffed. I've seen guys get lucky. A blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while. 4 times? Back to back? With a Barrett? That's no squirrel, man. Across the room, another voice joined in. Heard she outshot instructors back at Bragg. Some say she was topping leaderboards before she even deployed. Bullshit, someone else said, louder this time. I trained at Bragg. Nobody that young comes close. It's just campfire talk. Hype. The voices rose and fell like a tide. Some swore she was the real deal. Others dismissed it as rumor. The more the chief listened, the more he realized it wasn't just idle gossip. It was dividing the camp. He sat on the edge of his cot, silent, arms resting on his knees, gaze fixed on the floor. He'd learned long ago that listening told you more than asking. Men revealed themselves when they thought no one important was paying attention. What struck him wasn't just the words, but the tone. Half the men sounded threatened. Not by her presence, but by what it implied. If the whispers were true, if she was as good as they said, then where did that leave the rest of them? In the military, pride was a fragile thing. Soldiers built themselves on reputation, on stories carried from one deployment to the next. A single newcomer outperforming veterans could shake the ground beneath their feet. The chief understood that better than most. He'd lived it himself as a young SEAL, clawing for recognition among giants, every mission a test of worth. But this was different. She wasn't clawing. She wasn't boasting. She was simply there. And that unsettled people. A young private leaned in close to his bunkmate, voice dropping. Heard she put down a high-value target. Over 3 clicks out. Record-breaking distance. His bunkmate snorted. 3 clicks? That's fairy tale shit. Nobody hits at 3 clicks. Not even Canadians. I'm telling you, I heard it from someone who read the file. Confirmed kill. The chief's head lifted slightly at that. He didn't move, didn't react, but the words etched themselves into his mind. 3 clicks. 3,000 meters. He'd heard of such shots, legendary ones whispered in sniper schools, debated in military circles. If true, it was more than impressive. It was historic. But soldiers loved exaggeration. A hit at 1,800 became 2,500 in the retelling. A firefight with 2 insurgents turned into a dozen. The line between fact and story blurred with every telling, and in the barracks, legends grew legs overnight. Still, the chief couldn't ignore the consistency. Every rumor, every whisper, circled the same core. Her skill with the Barrett wasn't normal. From his cot, he glanced across the room. She wasn't there. Probably in the armory again, cleaning, or maybe out on the perimeter, eyes on the horizon. She didn't linger in these circles, didn't sit at card tables or lean against the wall swapping jokes. She lived apart, not out of arrogance, but by choice. That only fueled the rumors. Silence makes better legends than speeches. Bet she won't last, one voice muttered, breaking the chief's thoughts. Once she's in the shit, it's different. Sandstorms, crossfire, civilians in the way. Paper targets don't shoot back. That got a few chuckles. Nervous ones. The chief rose slowly, boots crunching against the gritty floor. The room quieted a little. His presence had that effect. Years of scars and stripes carried weight. He didn't speak, just walked out, the cool night air rushing his face as he stepped into the courtyard. The FOB was quieter outside. A generator hummed. A distant convoy rumbled, but otherwise it was still. The stars stretched endless overhead, sharp against the black sky. He lit a cigarette, the ember glowing in the dark, and leaned against the wall. His mind replayed the whispers, the doubt, the awe, the disbelief. He'd seen how stories could inflate, But he'd also seen how legends were born, from a single act that defied explanation. And something told him, with the way she carried herself, with the way she let her rifle do the talking, that the truth behind the whispers might be greater than the fiction. Still, he needed proof. Rumors weren't enough. He'd learned to trust what he saw with his own eyes. He exhaled smoke into the night. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd watch closer. He'd put himself near her on the line, in drills, maybe even in the field if command allowed. Because whispers could build a soldier's reputation. But only actions could prove it. And the chief wanted to know if the legend forming in the barracks was real, or if, like so many before, it would crumble under the weight of truth. The chief wasn't looking for her file. He never wasted time digging through personnel records, unless something forced him to, unless someone's performance or mistakes demanded a closer look. But that night, alone in the operations tent, with the generators humming outside and the maps of hostile sectors glowing under red lights, her name appeared in front of him. The file wasn't thick. Most weren't. A few pages, a handful of mission reports, and clipped details that barely scratched the surface of who a soldier really was. But sometimes the smallest line carried the heaviest weight. His eyes scanned the pages, half-focused, until they stopped cold. Confirmed kill minus 3,247 meters. The chief froze. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, leaned closer. The number didn't change. 3,247. A distance so far it didn't feel real. Nearly 2 miles. He'd read about Canadian snipers pushing past 3 clicks, heard of long-range legends whispered about in sniper schools, but those were anomalies, rare feats etched in military lore. And here it was, typed cleanly in black and white under her name. He leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. For a long time, he stared at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the hum of the lights. His mind ticked back to the barracks whispers, the disbelief, the scoffs. Now he knew. It wasn't rumor. It wasn't hype. It was fact. And it wasn't just the distance that struck him. It was the confirmation. A shot like that wasn't logged unless there was proof, unless command had verified it beyond doubt. That meant eyes on, corroboration, maybe even drone footage. This wasn't a ghost story soldiers told each other to pass the time. This was documented. His skepticism cracked. The chief had spent years surrounded by elite shooters. He'd fired sniper rifles himself, trained alongside men who could cut a playing card in half from a football field away. But he also knew the gulf between 1 mile and 2 was an ocean. At that range, the bullet wasn't just dropping. It was falling like a stone. The Earth's rotation came into play, the spin of the planet itself shifting the round's path. 1,000 variables conspired against you. Wind, humidity, mirage, temperature. At 3,247 meters, a heartbeat could send the round astray. And she had made it. The thought sent a ripple through him he hadn't felt in years. Respect, and something else. The quiet thrill of knowing he was in the presence of history. He set the file down, hands steepled in front of his face. Questions swirled. How had she done it? What conditions? What was the target? The report was brief, clinical. High-value insurgent. Engagement confirmed. Shot distance verified. No story, no color. Just fact. But the chief knew what wasn't written mattered more. The hours leading up to the shot. The patience. The calculations. The steadying of nerves. He pictured her lying prone in the dust, wind biting, sun boiling, heartbeat slowing until the world shrank down to a single trigger pull. He felt his jaw tighten. The barracks chatter didn't matter anymore. The whispers of jealousy, the muttered disbelief, all of it was noise. He had the truth in front of him. and truth in war was rare. Still, he kept it to himself. Walking back across the FOB, he didn't tell anyone what he'd read. He didn't mention the record, didn't add fuel to the rumors. Some things were better left unspoken, at least until he had the chance to see more with his own eyes. But the knowledge changed the way he looked at her. The next morning, he spotted her by the motor pool, leaning against a truck, sipping coffee from a tin cup. Same calm presence, same silence that seemed to draw space around her. But now, when he saw her hands wrapped around the cup, he thought about those same hands steadying the Barrett for a shot across 3 kilometers of open earth. He walked past without speaking, though his eyes lingered a second longer. She caught it. She always seemed to catch everything. Their gazes met briefly. There was no challenge, no pride, no explanation. Just acknowledgement. He wondered if she knew he'd seen the file. That evening, the whispers grew again. The barracks buzzed with the usual mix of boredom and tension, but the chief heard her name again and again. Each story stretched further, inflated bigger. Some said she'd hit targets in total darkness, others that she could split a bullet on a blade. Typical barracks mythology. But this time, the chief didn't scoff inwardly. He let the stories wash over him, because deep down, he knew the truth was already stranger than the fiction. Later, as he sat cleaning his sidearm, one of the younger sergeants leaned over. "Chief, you've been around. You think she's legit?" A chief didn't answer right away. He slid the slide back on his pistol, clicked it forward, and placed it gently on the table. Then he looked up. "I think some of you don't know what legit really looks like." The sergeant blinked, caught off guard. The chief stood, holstered his weapon, and left the room without another word. In the silence that followed, the younger men glanced at each other. The chief's reputation carried weight. If he wasn't laughing off the rumors anymore, maybe, just maybe, they weren't rumors at all. That night, the chief lay awake on his cot, staring at the corrugated ceiling. He replayed the number in his head, 3,247. He thought of the men he'd lost, the firefights fought at 50 meters, at 5 meters. How different the war looked through a scope at that distance. Cold, detached, almost surgical. But war was never cold. The blood, the noise, the chaos, all of it still weighed heavy. Even for a sniper. Maybe especially for one. He wondered what it did to her, carrying that shot. To know you'd taken a life from so far away, a life that never even knew you were there. Did she feel pride? Relief? Nothing at all? Or did she carry it like a stone in her chest, silent and heavy? The chief rolled onto his side, closing his eyes. He knew he'd find out eventually. He always did. For now, though, he had his answer. She wasn't a rumor. She wasn't hype. She was real. And the next time he saw her with the Barrett slung across her back, he didn't see a young woman in a war zone. He saw a legend walking quietly among mortals. The desert was alive that day, not with birdsong or breeze, but with silence, the kind of silence that screamed. It pressed down on her as she lay in the dirt, rifle resting on its bipod, the heat shimmering off the horizon like a mirage. Hours had passed, each one stretching thin, time marked only by her breathing and the rhythm of her heartbeat. The Barrett .50 lay heavy against her shoulder, its long barrel aimed toward a cluster of stone buildings nearly 2 miles away. Through her scope, the world shrank to that village, a handful of mud brick homes, a well, a pickup truck baking in the sun, and one figure. Her spotter whispered beside her, voice barely audible. "Target sighted. Confirmed. HVT, 2 guards." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed glued to the scope, tracking the man who had just stepped from the doorway. Mid-40s, lean, dressed in a white dish dasha, that caught the wind. The man was no ordinary insurgent. Intelligence reports had painted him as the architect of roadside bombs that had torn through convoys for months. He was the kind of ghost who moved between safe houses, slipping away every time U.S. forces closed in. But today, luck or fate had put him in her crosshairs. Range? She whispered back. 3247, the spotter said. His tone carried disbelief even as he spoke. Winds shifting. Quartering from the northwest, 12 knots. 3,247 meters. The number pressed into her mind. No shot like this was routine. At that distance, even the Earth itself was an enemy. Coriolis effect, spindrift, air density, all had to be accounted for. A single miscalculation, and the round would vanish into the horizon. She adjusted her scope, fingers steady, movements exact. Every adjustment was a conversation between her and the rifle, between mathematics and instinct. The Barrett was unforgiving, but it rewarded patience. The chief wasn't there that day. But later, when he read the file, he would wonder how she felt in that moment. Whether her hands trembled, whether doubt crept in. The truth was simpler. She didn't think about herself at all. Her mind focused only on the shot. Humidity's dropping, the spotter said, checking his kestrel meter. Temps holding at 105, she adjusted again. A bead of sweat rolled down her cheek, stinging her eye. She ignored it. Her breathing slowed. In, out, in, out. The world outside the scope ceased to exist. There was only the target. Through the glass, she saw the HVT gesture to one of his guards. A cigarette flared. He laughed at something the guard said, utterly unaware that his life balanced on the edge of a trigger pull 2 miles away. Take the shot when ready, her spotter whispered. She didn't move. Seconds passed. Then a full minute. Her finger rested on the trigger, but she waited. Sniping wasn't about firing quickly. It was about knowing the exact second when the universe aligned. Wind, distance, breath, and willpower all converging. Finally, the guard stepped aside, giving her a clear line. The target stood tall, exposed. Her lungs emptied slowly. Her finger squeezed. The Barrett roared. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. Dust exploded from the ground, echoing the rifle's thunder. The bullet screamed into the distance, invisible, a piece of metal defying physics across the barren expanse. Time stretched. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Just silence. She watched through the scope, unblinking, every muscle taut. Then the target dropped. One moment standing, the next crumpled, lifeless in the sand. The guard shouted, confusion spreading like fire. They scanned the rooftops, the horizon, everywhere, but not here. They couldn't even imagine the shot had come from so far. Impact, the spotter breathed. His voice cracked with awe. Holy shit. Direct hit. She didn't smile. She didn't pump her fist or celebrate. She simply let her cheek rest against the stock, eyes still on the scope. The kill was clean, surgical. But inside, something shifted. Every sniper carried their first confirmed kill differently. Some felt pride, some guilt, some nothing at all. But this wasn't her first. She had pulled the trigger before. She knew the weight, but never from this distance. Never with so much stacked against her. For a moment, she thought of the men lost to the bombs this target had ordered. She thought of convoys burning, of body bags draped in flags. She told herself this shot wasn't about numbers. It was about stopping him from killing more. And yet, as the adrenaline faded, she knew the number would follow her. 3,247. It would appear in reports, in whispers, maybe even in history books if command ever declassified it. But numbers didn't tell the story. They never did. Her spotter clapped her on the back. That's a world record. You know that, right? World fucking record. She didn't answer. She began the slow process of breaking down her rifle, checking the chamber, wiping dust from the scope. For her, the mission wasn't about records. It was about the silence after the shot, the silence she would carry long after the desert was behind her. By nightfall, they were exfiltrated, her identity swallowed again into the anonymity of the uniform. Command would log the kill, verify it, and file it away. The world wouldn't know. But the legend had been born. Back at base, she lay awake in her cot, staring at the ceiling. Around her, soldiers snored, radios crackled faintly. She replayed the shot in her mind, not out of pride, but because it was burned into her memory. The moment the crosshairs aligned, the squeeze, the stillness. And though she told herself it was just another mission, a part of her knew it wasn't. This one would follow her forever. The number haunted her. Not the face, not even the body that had fallen so far away in the sand, but the number, 3,247. It came to her at night, a whisper in the silence. It followed her in daylight, etched invisible on the dust of her boots, on the metal of the Barrett slung across her back. The world thought records meant glory. She knew better. In the weeks that followed, she carried herself no differently. She moved through the base with the same steady gait, spoke little, kept to her rifle like a shadow. But the chief had seen enough men and women wear war on their shoulders to know the signs. It was in the way her eyes lingered a moment longer on empty desert horizons, as if she were still staring through that scope. It was in the way her silence thickened, not just natural quiet anymore, but something heavier, as though words couldn't cut through it. The barracks still buzzed with whispers. By now, most of the unit had heard about the record. Some dismissed it outright, laughing it off as impossible. Others clung to it like gospel, bragging to anyone who'd listen that they served alongside the best sniper alive. But none of them understood what the chief did, that the truth of a shot like that wasn't glory. It was weight. He found her one evening by the firing range, cleaning the Barrett in the fading light. The sun bled orange across the horizon, heat dying down into cool desert night. She worked slowly, every piece of the rifle laid out with precision, hands moving like clockwork. "You treat that thing like it's alive," the chief said quietly, stepping up beside her. She glanced at him, expression unreadable. "It might as well be," he nodded, lowering himself onto the bench across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the soft rasp of a cleaning cloth against steel filled the air. Finally, the chief leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. "I saw your file." Her hands froze for half a second. Cloth paused mid-stroke. Then she resumed, voice even. "And? 3-2-4-7. Double quotes." The chief said the number slowly, letting it hang. "That's not just a kill. That's history." She didn't look up. "History doesn't matter out here, doesn't it?" He pressed. "Every man and woman on this base talks about it. You don't hear them, but I do. They don't stop. You're a ghost story now, and you're still breathing." She finally met his gaze. Her eyes were calm, but behind them he saw it, the storm she never let surface. Ghost stories are for people who don't understand what it costs. The chief leaned back, studying her. He had expected pride, maybe a flicker of satisfaction. Instead, he saw only a quiet heaviness. She set the rifle down gently, almost reverently. "Do you know what a shot like that means? It's not just pulling a trigger. It's hours of stillness, fighting your own heartbeat. It's trusting math more than instinct. It's knowing you're reaching across miles to end a life that doesn't even know you exist." The chief listened, silent. She exhaled slowly, almost a sigh. People think it's glory. But all I see when I close my eyes is the moment after. The stillness. The silence. No cheers. No pats on the back. Just nothing. And then the number follows you. Forever. The chief understood. More than most. He'd seen medals pinned on soldiers who never slept again. He'd seen records broken, but always at a cost no one talked about in the after-action reports. He nodded once. That number's heavy. But you carried it. Doesn't mean it has to crush you. Her gaze drifted back to the rifle. It already does. The words hung between them, heavier than the desert air. Later that night, back in the barracks, the chief lay awake. He thought of her words, of the way her voice hadn't cracked, hadn't faltered, but carried the kind of weight that didn't need volume. He thought about all the times he'd told his men that war didn't care about records, only about survival. And yet here she was, surviving under the shadow of one. The chief began to see her differently after that. Not as the legend the whispers painted, but as a soldier carrying an invisible rucksack no one else could shoulder. He noticed how she avoided conversations when the others bragged about their kills, how she slipped away when the topic turned to sniping. He saw how her hands lingered on the Barrett longer than necessary, as if the rifle itself held part of her she couldn't let go. And though he never said it out loud, a quiet respect grew inside him. Not for the number, not for the record, but for her refusal to let it define her. She bore it silently, without complaint, without feeding the myth. That silence, he realized, was louder than any boast. But silence had its dangers. One night, weeks after the mission, the chief found her on the rooftop of the barracks, sitting alone under the stars. The desert was cold, wind cutting sharp, but she sat motionless, arms wrapped loosely around her knees. He approached slowly, boots crunching on the gravel. Couldn't sleep? Her eyes stayed on the horizon. Haven't in a while. He eased down beside her, the cold seeping through his uniform. For a while, they said nothing. The stars above stretched endless, indifferent to the wars fought below. Finally, she spoke, voice quiet but steady. You ever wonder if we're remembered for what we do? Or just for the things that break us? The chief thought of the men buried overseas, of names etched into plaques. He thought of medals gathering dust in boxes, of stories that grew into legends long after the truth had been forgotten. He thought of her and that impossible number. Both, he said finally. We're remembered for what we did. But it's what breaks us that makes us real. She nodded faintly, as if the words settled something, if only for the night. And in that moment, the chief realized something. She wasn't just carrying the weight of a record. She was carrying the silence of every soldier who had ever pulled a trigger and walked away with nothing but numbers etched on their soul. And though the world might never understand, he did. Because behind the legend, behind the whispers, and the file stamped with 3,247 meters, she wasn't just a sniper. She was human. And that, the chief knew, was what made her story worth remembering. The chief had never been a man to take things at face value. Records were one thing, stories another, but performance under pressure, that was the real test. War didn't hand out certificates for past victories. It only asked one question. Can you do it again, right now, when it counts? He'd seen too many soldiers ride the wave of a single great moment, then fold when reality hit again. He needed to know if she was different. Not for himself. For the team. Legends didn't matter in the dirt. What mattered was whether she could still deliver. So one morning, under a sun already punishing the horizon, the chief ordered a field test. Range day, he announced flatly to the squad. Full kit, real conditions. Not the comfy shooting lanes you're used to. Groans rippled through the unit. Range days under the chief were never easy. He believed in sweat before blood, in turning training into the closest thing to combat. His men knew they'd be crawling through dust, sweating under body armor, firing until their shoulders ached. But this time, he had something different in mind. He pulled her aside quietly, away from the group. "You're running the long gun today." Her eyes flicked to him, calm, unreadable as ever. "The Barrett?" He nodded. "You'll have eyes on, but no spotter this time. Just you, solo." Her gaze held his for a moment, searching, but she didn't argue. She only gave the smallest of nods. By mid-morning, they were outside the wire, a makeshift range carved into the endless desert. Targets stood silhouetted against the sand, some close, some at staggering distances. The heat shimmered, distorting the air, making even the nearest silhouettes dance like ghosts. The squad set up, joking and grumbling as they unpacked gear. But when the chief laid the Barrett down in front of her, silence spread. Everyone's eyes turned. "Thought this was a group shoot, Chief," one soldier muttered. "It is," the chief said evenly. "But today, you're going to learn something." He looked at her. "And so am I." She lay prone, adjusting the bipod, pressing her cheek against the stock. The rifle seemed to mold into her, a natural extension of her body. Around her, the squad gathered, pretending not to stare, but unable to look away. The chief gave the order. "Engage." The first target was set at 1,000 meters. Child's play for anyone trained, but he watched closely. Her breathing slowed, shoulders loose. The Barrett thundered, and the steel plate rang out seconds later. A clean hit dead center. The men muttered. Impressed, but not yet convinced. The chief pushed it further. 2,000 meters. Her scope shifted. Adjustments came quick, precise, without hesitation. The rifle boomed again, echoing across the desert. Seconds stretched before the plate at 2 clicks rattled violently. Now the murmurs grew louder. Eyes widened. This wasn't luck. But the chief wasn't finished. He'd saved his true test for last. He pointed toward the horizon, where a single target had been set farther than any of them had ever shot in training. The shimmer of heat made it almost invisible. The rangefinder confirmed it. 3,200 meters. Practically the same distance as the record. "Engage," he said simply. The squad erupted in whispers. "No way, Chief's insane." "That's impossible." She didn't flinch. Didn't argue. She simply adjusted, inch by inch, her movements deliberate, mechanical, as if the calculations had already played out in her mind. The desert stilled. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting. She inhaled, exhaled, finger resting on the trigger. The Barrett cracked, the recoil kicking dust into the air. A bullet disappeared into the shimmering distance. Seconds crawled, 5, 6, 7, then clang. The steel target swayed. A perfect strike. The squad erupted in shouts, curses, disbelief. Some laughed, some just stared with jaws slack. The chief didn't cheer. He only watched her. She didn't bask in it, didn't even smile. She simply racked the bolt, chambered another round, and scanned for the next target, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He stepped closer, kneeling beside her. "Why do you make it look so easy?" he asked quietly. Her eye stayed on the scope. "Because if it looks easy, maybe they won't see the weight behind it." The chief didn't answer. For the first time, he felt a chill despite the desert heat. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't chasing applause. She was carrying the record again and again because she had no other choice. After the exercise, the squad was electric. Every man wanted to talk about what they'd seen, each version of the story growing bigger by the minute. By evening, half the base had already heard that she'd hit 4 clicks without even trying. But the chief stayed quiet. He wasn't interested in the myth anymore. He'd seen what he needed to see. That night, he found her sitting alone again, rifle across her knees. He studied her in the dim light, the way she cleaned the weapon with almost ritual care. "You didn't have to prove anything," he said. She glanced at him, then back to the rifle. "You needed to see it. So I showed you." The chief shook his head. "No, you didn't just show me skill. You showed me control. That's rarer." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then he added softly, "You carry that number well. Better than most would." Her hands stilled, cloth resting on the cold steel. "No one carries it well. Some of us just carry it longer," the chief understood. And for the first time since he'd read her file, he no longer wondered if the legend was real. He knew. She wasn't just a sniper with a record. She was proof that even the heaviest burdens could be borne in silence, if only for a little while. The desert was quieter now. The sun had fallen behind jagged ridges, leaving the FOB bathed in the soft glow of lanterns and fading warmth. Soldiers moved through the shadows, tending to gear, sharing muted laughs, or nursing aches in silence. The chief walked alone toward the edge of the perimeter, eyes scanning the horizon. He thought of the first day he had seen her, the young woman with the Barrett M82 slung effortlessly across her shoulders. The whispers in the barracks, the impossible 3,247-meter kill, the field tests he had put her through, all of it had led to this moment. It wasn't the record that defined her. It was how she carried it. How she moved through life in the heat of war with a weight no one else could imagine, yet showed nothing outwardly. That silence, that control, had transformed the legends whispered in the barracks into something tangible, something real. The chief found her sitting on the roof of the operations tent, legs dangling over the edge, the Barrett resting beside her. The wind tugged lightly at her uniform, teasing her hair loose from its tie. She hadn't noticed him yet. He paused, watching her, the way a historian studies an artifact, careful, reverent, knowing the gravity of what had survived through time. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She glanced up, expression unreadable, then nodded. "I suppose not." He lowered himself beside her, leaving space, letting the quiet of the desert stretch between them. For a while, neither spoke. Only the wind and distant hum of generators filled the void. Finally, he said, "I've seen a lot of soldiers in my life. Men and women who carried medals, scars, and records. But few carry the burden without letting it break them. You. You do." She looked at him, eyes reflecting the fading sky. "It's not about breaking. It's about living with it." The chief studied her face. He could see the traces of what others never noticed, the faint tension in her jaw, the way her hands lingered on the rifle, even when it wasn't necessary, the distant glint in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. All of it spoke of someone who had lived through moments that most would never imagine. "You've changed things here," he said softly. "Not just the shots, not just the record, but how the men see what's possible. Some will never admit it, but they're better because of you." She let the words hang, neither agreeing nor denying. Maybe, or maybe they just whisper louder about what they think they've seen. He chuckled quietly, shaking his head. Maybe both. The chief leaned back, looking out over the desert. Records fade. Stories get exaggerated or forgotten. But the way you handle yourself, that doesn't fade? That's the real legacy. She studied the horizon, letting the silence answer for her. The days rolled into weeks, and her presence at the FOB became quietly legendary. Soldiers spoke less about the impossibility of her feats, and more about the calm authority she brought into every operation. When missions turned desperate, when heat and dust and fear pressed down, her reputation alone inspired steadiness. Men and women followed her lead not out of fear, but out of respect for someone who had carried more than anyone else dared to carry. The chief watched all of it unfold with quiet satisfaction. He had seen history written in numbers, but he had also witnessed it in action, the subtle movements, the careful calculations, the patience, and the restraint that defined her. One evening, after a particularly grueling training rotation, he found her again in the armory, meticulously cleaning the Barrett. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You know," he began, "if someone didn't know better, they'd think you were untouchable." She didn't look up. "I'm not. Everyone's touchable. Touchable, maybe," he said, "but you've turned that touch into something else. Strength, discipline, control." Her fingers paused, resting gently on the barrel. "I don't think about that. I think about the next mission, the next shot, the next moment I need to be ready. Legends don't survive in the desert. Only people do." The chief nodded, knowing she was right. Legends were fragile. Soldiers survived. That was the difference. As night fell fully, the FOB-D quieted. Soldiers slept, equipment rested, and only the desert hummed softly. The chief walked back to his quarters, glancing once more at the young sniper, who had carried the weight of history with silent resolve. In the weeks and months that followed, she moved through her deployments with the same quiet efficiency. She never spoke of her record, never flaunted it, never sought applause. But everywhere she went, soldiers watched. They whispered. They studied her technique. They learned from the calm that preceded every shot, the stillness that carried more weight than the gun itself. By the time she rotated back home, the chief realized that her story had already begun to ripple outward. Her 3,247-meter kill would be mentioned in reports, whispered among instructors, and studied by other snipers. But the true story, the story of patience, control, and quiet discipline under unimaginable pressure, would be understood only by those who had seen her in action. The chief thought of all the soldiers who had served alongside her, the barracks whispers, the field exercises, the long, still hours spent scanning deserts for a single point of life. And he knew this. She had become more than a record. She had become a standard. He smiled faintly, leaning back against the rail of the FOB. Legends might be written in numbers, but legacies, true legacies, were written in the way someone moved through the world, untouched by praise, unshaken by fear, and unbroken by the weight they carried. And in the quiet desert night, he realized that she had already left her mark. A ghost, they would call her someday. A sniper with a record. A name etched into history. But to the chief, and to those who had truly seen her, she was something more. A testament to human endurance. A symbol of silent strength, and a reminder that true greatness is never loud. And as the stars blinked over the desert, he knew the legend would live, not in whispers, not in numbers, but in the example she left behind.